When I play a game for review, one point that I always consider is if I'm having fun. Though I never cite this as a direct criteria, as I believe that it's subjective, a fun game to me will always get more grace than a boring or even a bad one. In saying that, the Mobius strip is a mathematical and scientific miracle that can occur and is featured in the game that we're talking about today, the Mobius machine. What's interesting about the Mobius strip is its optical illusion that the strip flips 180 degrees without ever breaking its line. That, to me, is the true fun factor of the Mobius machine as well. When everything works, you've got a beautiful, side-scrolling Metroidvania set on a dangerous alien planet. On the inverse, when the level design fails you or the combat begins to grade you down, it can feel far less than enjoyable. To cover your need-to-knows, the Mobius machine is coming from Madruga Works on March 1st, 2024, and it's coming to PC, PlayStation, and of course Xbox as well. As a little side tangent, I didn't get the game to run as well as I would have liked on the Steam Deck. It's technically playable, but it's not the optimal experience in my opinion, but I just wanted to kind of rule that out, even though some people may want to try it there. But my name is Falling Hurts, and I do reviews like this a good bit of the time, as well as game previews. So if you're into either of those things, consider subscribing. There's going to be a lot more of it in 2024. And the way I do reviews is I break things down into the story, the gameplay, the visuals, and the sound design. And with that being said, let's go ahead and hop right in with the story. And there is a story, or at least hints of one. It's very hands-off. It's like if an indie horror game didn't have any notes to read. Just truly a beginning and an end with maybe one or two small moments throughout. The setup is simple. You're a cargo ship who hears a distress beacon on a nearby planet. After crash landing, your mission is to climb the beacon tower in search of help and the source of the call that originally brought you there. The opening of the game was really stylish in presentation, with the way the ship moved, clearly still in that 2D plane, and the conversations with your AI companion. However, that's pretty much lost as soon as you're on the planet and it opens up to the greater gameplay design. There is a twist ending to the game that isn't really a twist if you understand the premise, but all the same, it's a really cool sci-fi concept. Ultimately, the Mobius machine isn't about the story, and it's important to know that going in. But at the same time, there's enough here to make it a cool little tale, if nothing else. But it's definitely not any of the reasons that you should buy this game. Moving on, let's talk about the gameplay. So this is a Metroidvania through and through. Though due to the game's use of guns, it's far closer to Metroid over anything else, and it's a brilliant homage in a lot of ways. And skipping the combat and other gameplay loops for now, there are multiple locations in the game, each sporting their own visuals, sound, and atmosphere. The gameplay of these levels can vary a good bit too. Some levels are mechanical jungles full of conveyor belts and missile turrets, while others are high in the sky that require a glider to traverse effectively. And that's my favorite part about the environmental design in this game. There's both the closed, tight corridors as well as the wide open spaces. At first, it was deceivingly simple and large play spaces that felt relatively useless. Having not watched the trailers, I was unaware of any of the upgrades that I'd be getting. But as I got the climbing axes, a tool that allows you to climb up dirt walls, or even a later traversal tool like the glider, then it really becomes clear just how much of this space is properly utilized. You'll be able to find secrets in earlier levels and even have to circle back for certain instances of advancing through the world to complete your goal. To me, this is the main aspect of a Metroidvania, and it does a really good job here, and it was never unintuitive to the point where I felt like I was getting too lost. All of these biomes flow together fairly well. In a way, it was more apt to be compared to the level design of Dark Souls 1. Smart looping around that made your runs less inconvenient on the second go-through, and it always felt intuitive in that regard as well. Not to mention, each biome has one fast travel point that makes it at least a little bit easier to get somewhere once you've already been there. That Dark Souls comparison really doesn't end there though, as there is combat in the game, and if you do die from one way or the other, you will drop some of your upgrade points that you have on you, and you'll need to run back to get them. However, it's fairly forgiving in the sense that even on your death runs, going back to find these items, no matter how many times you die, as far as I can tell, you should be able to still claim some of these rewards whenever you're going back around. So it's not like, hey, if I die again, I've lost what I've already dropped. Circling back around though, one issue I did have was finding the actual map rooms themselves. As you enter a new sector, you have to find and download the map in order for you to fill it out as you go. The problem is, it's not always super close to the start of the area. Perhaps in the later level I didn't enter the preferred route, like maybe I had performed a sequence break in some way, but I don't believe that's true. But getting to the map, a crucial item for progression, was simply a slog for me. It was in those times of trying to find the maps that my issues with the level design became more apparent. Outside of the map placement itself, it also becomes more noticeable later in the game that there are some reused building layouts. This is fine, and there's even different enemy placements within them, but hypothetically it could be a bit confusing to someone who uses these buildings as points of reference when they don't have a map. On top of that, throw in the fact that you've got some harder than usual enemies, along with even more demanding platforming in those later areas, and it can all be a bit frustrating when you're not getting to where you want to be. To be clear, those aspects are actually totally positives if the map was easy to locate right off the bat upon entering those later levels. Oh, also, when you're using a glider, sometimes you've no idea where the platform is that you're trying to get to, because the screen is so tight, and without a map, there's no way to even potentially check where you need to line up to. So unless the devs want to pull the camera back while you're gliding, or maybe allow you to kind of look around a little more easily, I can't not recommend Googling where the map is in that sky location later in the game. Speaking on the actual platforming itself really quick, I loved it. To me, this was the shining star of the game, as well as the layered progression with new tools. The game features a short and long jump, which based on how long you hold down the jump button, and it feels really nice and responsive. Plus, the thrusters to get across gaps of falling floor is a great throwback to the games that it's inspired by. Or when you have to power boost underwater and the tracking missiles turn into kind of like a pseudo chase sequence, if you will, and you can't help but feel the pressure of the frame perfection in those moments. Another big difference in each of these levels is whether each location features the planet's local fauna or the robotic creations of the humans of the past. The range of enemy variety is wide. There are plenty of enemies that, much like the British, charge the player from land, air, or sea. There's also a wide assortment of ranged enemies shooting beams and spores. These shots range from fast to slow, shooting straight off in any direction, or even targeting the player specifically. And it all can be mixed together when the enemy composition is just right. And I rarely had any instances where it felt like enemies were too or, underburdened. Both factions of enemies have the same fundamental enemy types, but as you progress through the game, my favorite thing is how these base enemies became modified. Aliens became more aggressive, and the robots also did the same while also self-destructing when defeated. And little instances like this really added to that variety. The boss fights are well paced too, generally featuring one per area. They are pretty simple at first, but they work their way up. From a simple giant enemy, then there's some platforming involved, and then you've also got to worry about hitting weak points and a bullet hell of enemies around you. And the developers truly knew what they were doing because each fight felt like they were building on the knowledge that you've developed from the last. Now, as for how you're fighting the enemies of the game with your arsenal, which is relatively limited, I gotta say. You've got your main blaster shot, which is like your machine gun, that you can upgrade for faster fire and more damage rates, but you can have different modules as well, such as the shotgun blast, which is short range, but hits for sure right in front of you, or the longer range sniper shots, along with another one. And all of these feel varied, and I did find myself switching between them for proper usage. Now, unlike Super Metroid, you can aim 360 degrees in the game, and it feels wonderful. This, along with utilizing both triggers to alternate fire methods, is super fluid. You can find upgrades and new crafting modules throughout the world, which you can take to the crafting station and use those points I mentioned earlier to craft your upgrades, which you do get these points from killing enemies. There's also a few upgrades for health and your energy meters, and even the range at which you collect energy from downed enemies. The upgrades are all super useful and feel worthwhile, which is good because I do feel like they were pretty scarce. I completed the game 76%, and I felt like I got one or two upgrades for each of these categories, so in the end it felt fair, and I felt more than equipped by the end of the game. The only upgrade I felt was truly necessary from the start of the game rather than finding it was actually the attractor, the one that increases your pickup range, because this is a must-have in the game for it to feel truly fun and not a really tedious mess. And thankfully you still find it fairly early. Now, one thing that I didn't like so much was that you needed to use some of those points to repair generators around the map. Hypothetically, if the player found one of these too early, or he spent all of their savings just prior to that, only for them to have to grind up more and more points to, repair one of these generators, I just don't see how grinding in a Metroidvania feels like the right thing to do. I get maybe killing a few enemies here or there to kind of increase your health pool, but considering the game doesn't ask anything else of these points other than upgrades and generators, it just feels really out of place. And I just don't think the gameplay loop is really designed for these types of challenges in mind. Now, all of that being said, I feel like I have properly covered the gameplay to as good of a degree as you need to know for a review. Now, speaking on the visuals and the sound design specifically, there's a good bit to talk about. And as I said, I feel like the starting of the game was really strong. And one aspect that I thought was a bit more hit or miss was the soundtrack itself. And I know this is kind of standard issue for these types of games to have, one solid track to be playing out certain environments, but there were times where I felt like if I was in combat or out of combat, I would have liked to hear a little more aggressive tracks over, say, a lot more calming version of a certain track. Though I will say not all music sounded that way, so it was a very weird mix at times. And it's important to note that there's no voice acting within the game. It's not really a problem to pretty much anyone. There's not even a lot of dialogue within the game, but I guess it's there. But outside of that though, I gotta say, this game does a really great job of keying the player in to what's going on, either in the periphery just outside of the screen's view, or anywhere on screen, because sometimes you have to tunnel vision to kill certain enemies. Whether it be the sound effects of certain attacks going off or certain enemies that could be near or just out of view sometimes, it's a really good way of showing exactly what's going on, even if you're not able to see it all at once. And in that way, I think this game is an assault on the senses in just the right way. But speaking of an assault on the senses, I think the game, visually speaking, is fairly good looking. The color palette does feel a little, less than ideal, but overall, individual textures and, the differences from environment to environment are there. I mean, I'm not going to say there's no color palette. That's not true at all. However, environments can feel a bit more samey based on the colors used. But right off the bat, like I said, there's a lot of style. The game can be super moody if it wants to be, with objects in the foreground and the background, adding to that sense of danger and mystique within the world. However, this isn't really present through the whole game. Like I'm playing through this clip here, you can kind of see exactly what I'm talking about. It even kind of highlights some of the textures in the foreground there, but when they're all in the background, it looks really great in motion. Specifically looking at those backgrounds, there's wide vistas within this game that are really impressive, and it really shows off just how great the lighting and the attention to detail in those moments can be. Especially as you can see fog or even, water in certain instances can kind of obstruct your full view. And once again, that really plays into that almost kind of moody atmosphere that the game can have, but it almost doesn't strive to do so most of the time. Even the shadows in the background with the 3D environments really stand out to be on the higher end of the visuals, so if you can play this game at max settings, I definitely do recommend that. And with that being said, I didn't really have any performance issues on an RTX 3070. However, like I said with the Steam Deck, I think the visual compromise with the performance wasn't really worth it. Another thing I noticed, if you're going from one dark environment to a lighter one, and say you've opened a shortcut, so a door opens really quickly, the whole screen will brighten up as though light has flooded the room that you're in. And it's so cool. I don't know, it's just a nice little detail of things like that you may not catch, your first time doing it yourself. And with that being said, I would like to hop into a little bit of a final verdict. The Mobius Machine by Madruga Works is a fairly competent entry in the Metroidvania genre. Specifically inspired by Metroid, you must survive on a planet of both alien creatures as well as robots in the hopes of escaping. In doing so, you'll unlock new tools for traversal as well as entering many different environments, fighting different creatures and bosses in order to reach your end goal. Visually speaking, I think the game is competent enough with minor dips in visuals here and there, and with a really solid soundscape overall. The game sometimes just doesn't want to commit to being as moody as I think it potentially could have been. Outside of that though, with a few issues with the level design, specifically with the placement of the maps, there can be moments where the game does drag on just a bit, but overall this was a super satisfying experience with really solid platforming and strong Metroidvania progression. And for me, at about 11 hours of playtime for $25 US, I think that's a great price for fans of the genre who want to get in on the ground floor of a new series. And ultimately, I really enjoyed this game, and I don't know that I'll ever necessarily go back to it because to me, I'm not that kind of player. However, I definitely look forward to whatever Madruga Works does do in the future. And with that being said, in a surprise twist, The video's not done yet, baby. We're not quite done. And that's because, there's this weird little thing where I have these deadlines to hit. I've got these videos I need to make, and sometimes I think YouTube wants to fuck me over with some shorts. So you're getting a little surprise review inside your review. So if you've made it this far, that's great. Otherwise, I'm just going to turn this into a short later, and it's going to be its own separate little video. But I needed to kind of sneak it in this one. So if you like that kind of fuckery, then consider subscribing. Honey Time with Pooh is what happens when you give the great people, aka Highlander Interactive, the public domain in 2024. For a mere $2, you can spend about 15 minutes in genuinely one of the weirdest games I've ever played. The visuals aren't great, but I think that adds to the horror. Throw in some weird muffled voice effect and Michael J. Fox heads, and you've got definitely some sort of style here for sure. Oh, or when you read the notes left by the previous escapee and they mention that Pooh was camping the road like a little shit. Unfortunately, the gameplay has none of that style, and even with a single chase sequence, it's not that engaging. The surveillance scene where the bear is outside while you collect his tools is cool. You can hear his heavy footsteps and he'll look in the window to make sure you aren't doing anything wrong. As a good game, this ain't it. As a fun one-time, play with your dumb friends staying the night, maybe. But really, that's up to you. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching this video. You got 2 reviews for the price of 1, and it's a lovely time to be me. I'm swimming in reviews right now, and I appreciate if you would subscribe and show me that it's all worth it. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.